Hello everyone. Tonight we're stepping into a world both fascinating and frightening. Imagine a civilization where the sunrise depended on a beating human heart, where towering pyramids weren't just monuments, but blood-soaked altars. So set your pillow and blanket, relax your mind, and get ready to dive into the haunting legacy of the Aztecs, a story of gods, rituals, and a fear that still echoes through time. Before we start, if you genuinely enjoy my work, please like and subscribe to the channel, and let me know in the comments where you're from and which city you're watching this video from. In the deep valleys and highlands of ancient Mesoamerica, where the earth met the sky in a dance of nature and time, a powerful civilization rose from the mists of history, brilliant, complex, and terrifying. The Aztecs, a people whose name still echoes through time, were not the first to walk this land, but they became its masters. Migrating from the northern deserts, they came to the Valley of Mexico in the 13th century, guided, they believed, by divine prophecy. After years of wandering, they settled on an island in the middle of Lake Texcoco, where they built one of the most astonishing cities the world has ever known, Tenochtitlan. From humble origins, this people, who once served as mercenaries for more powerful tribes, transformed into the rulers of a vast empire. They achieved military dominance, economic prosperity, and cultural brilliance. By the time Spanish conquistadors arrived in the early 1500s, the Aztec Empire stretched across hundreds of miles, encompassing millions of people, all tied to the central heart of power, Tenochtitlan. The city itself was a marvel, built on water, connected by causeways and aqueducts, filled with gardens, palaces, markets, and canals. It left European explorers in stunned admiration. Bernal Diaz del Castillo, who marched with Hernán Cortés, wrote that the city was more breathtaking than anything they had seen in Spain. Tenochtitlan gleamed with white stone and gold, alive with color and noise, home to poets, engineers, astronomers, and skilled warriors. Its people observed the stars, crafted intricate calendars, and built towering pyramids that rivaled those of Egypt. In many ways, the Aztecs represented the pinnacle of Mesoamerican civilization. But behind their greatness lay a dark, chilling truth. Beneath the beauty, beneath the order, beneath the rhythm of daily life was a constant, terrifying drumbeat, a heartbeat offered to gods that demanded blood. For all their sophistication, the Aztecs believed they lived on borrowed time. Their mythology told them the world had already ended 4 times before. Each age had ended in catastrophe, devoured by jaguars, swept away by floods, scorched by fire, or lost in violent winds. They lived in what they called the fifth sun, the final era, and this time the gods had made it clear: the balance of the world must be maintained through sacrifice. The sun would rise only if it was fed. The rain would fall only if children wept on the altar. The crops would grow only if blood was spilled on sacred soil. To live meant to give, and to give meant to die. Human sacrifice was not a hidden ritual performed in shadows. It was the center of Aztec spiritual life. Public, celebrated, and horrifying. Massive festivals were held in honor of gods like Huitzilopochtli, the god of the sun and war, or Tlaloc, the god of rain and fertility. On these days, thousands would gather in Tenochtitlan's central square, priests in ornate garments, led captured warriors, slaves, or chosen offerings up the steep steps of the towering Templo Maya, the city's great temple. At the top stood a flat stone, blackened with centuries of blood. The victim was laid on his back. 4 men held down his arms and legs. The priest, wielding a sharp obsidian blade, plunged it into the chest, slicing through flesh and bone, and ripped out the still-beating heart. It was lifted to the sky, then placed in a ceremonial bowl. The body, limp and lifeless, was cast down the temple steps, tumbling violently to the bottom, where it was gathered and sometimes used in ritual feasts. Blood ran like water. The crowd watched in reverent silence, or sometimes ecstatic celebration. This was not cruelty to the Aztecs. It was cosmic duty. To the modern world, this seems brutal beyond imagination. But to the Aztecs, it was balance. They saw the universe as fragile, teetering on the edge of collapse. The gods had sacrificed themselves to create the world. Now, humans had to repay that debt, again and again in an endless cycle of death that fed life. Even children were not spared. During ceremonies for Tlaloc, young boys and girls were brought to the mountains and offered in the rain god's honor. Their cries, it was said, pleased Tlaloc, and brought the rains that nourished the fields. If they did not cry, priests believed the ritual had failed. This belief system seeped into every corner of life. Warfare was not just about victory, it was about gathering prisoners for sacrifice. Warriors were trained not to kill, but to capture. The highest honor was to take a strong, brave enemy and deliver him to the temple. In return, the gods would grant the captor glory and the community good fortune. Even festivals, which might seem like joyous public events, were soaked in dread. Dancers wore the skins of sacrificed victims, painted their bodies with ash and blood, and reenacted the struggles of gods and monsters. Perhaps the most terrifying sight in all of Tenochtitlan was not the temple itself, but what stood beside it, a massive rack called the Tzompantle, constructed of wooden poles and beams where human skulls were strung like beads. Hundreds, sometimes thousands of skulls lined the racks in silent testimony to the gods' hunger. These were not hidden away. They were proudly displayed. When the Spanish arrived, they were horrified. And centuries later, archaeologists digging beneath modern Mexico City uncovered a skull tower, over 600 real human skulls mortared together in a great circle, confirming that the myths were true. And yet, in the middle of all this, the Aztecs built a world of astonishing beauty. Their engineers created floating gardens, chinampas, that fed the growing city. Their artisans crafted jewelry from jade, gold, and feathers so fine they seemed made of light. Their astronomers tracked the movement of Venus and the stars with extraordinary precision. Their schools taught math, poetry, history, and ritual. Their doctors used herbs, surgery, and even dentistry. And their legal system, structured with judges, courts, and appeals, was more advanced than many in Europe at the time. This was a people who wrote with pictographs, calculated eclipses, composed hymns to the gods, and yet saw blood as the price of survival. There is a strange and terrible beauty in this contradiction. The same hands that painted sacred scrolls with delicate brushes also held knives over trembling hearts. The same city that hosted vibrant marketplaces and peaceful families also echoed with the cries of the sacrificed. The Aztec world was not easy to understand. It defies simple labels. It was both brilliant and barbaric, luminous and lethal. It was a world where love, family, honor, and knowledge thrived side by side with fear, violence, and death. And it was all held together by a single, unshakable belief that the gods demanded blood and the people must obey. When the Spanish conquistadors finally entered Tenochtitlan, they were not prepared for what they saw. They had expected savages, but found a city more advanced than many in Europe. Still, what struck them most was not the beauty, but the blood. The smell of sacrifice, the sight of skulls, the tales of rituals disturbed them deeply. Hernán Cortés himself wrote to the King of Spain, describing the temples as dark, towering pyramids soaked in blood and filled with horrors. But even as they burned the temples and melted down the gold, the Spanish could not erase the memory. The legacy of the Aztecs, both glorious and ghastly, had already been carved into history. Today, what remains is a mixture of awe and fear. We admire the Aztecs for their brilliance, their organization, their knowledge, and their resilience. But we cannot ignore the shadow that followed them, the sacrifices, the skull racks, the blood-drenched temples. It is a story both fascinating and disturbing, a reminder that human history is filled with civilizations that reached for the stars while spilling blood on the ground. And perhaps that is what makes the Aztecs so unforgettable, not just what they built, but what they believed they had to destroy to keep it standing. In the end, the Aztec Empire fell, not because the gods abandoned them, but because other men arrived with steel and greed. Yet the memory remains. Vivid as ever, Tenochtitlan is gone, buried beneath Mexico City, but in the bones unearthed by archaeologists, in the stories passed down through time, and in the silent testimony of stone and skull, the voice of the Aztecs still whispers. It tells us of a world where beauty wore the mask of terror, where sacrifice was sacred, and where civilization was built, not just with stone and gold, but with blood. In the heart of the ancient Aztec world, where the sky burned bright and the mountains loomed like silent gods, time moved not in seconds and minutes, but in cycles and signs. The Aztecs did not simply mark days. They listened to them, believed in them, and feared them. They believed the universe was not a stable or permanent place, but rather a fragile creation, held together by rituals, duty, and above all, sacrifice. Their gods were not just spiritual symbols or abstract forces. They were living, breathing entities with desires, moods, and hunger, and nothing fed their hunger more than blood. The Aztecs saw the act of giving blood, especially human blood, as a sacred obligation, the very thing that kept the stars in the sky and the sun rising each morning. Among the vast pantheon of gods they worshipped, one stood above all in ferocity and power: Huitzilopochtli, the god of the sun and war. He was not a peaceful bringer of light. He was a warrior, eternally battling the forces of darkness, and it was the blood of men that fueled his strength. Huitzilopochtli's origin itself was rooted in violence and survival. According to Aztec legend, his mother, Coatlicue, was a goddess who became pregnant under mysterious circumstances. Her children, especially her daughter Coyolxauhqui and her 400 sons, the stars, were enraged and plotted to kill her. As they attacked, Huitzilopochtli sprang from her womb fully grown and armed. In a blinding burst of light and fury, he killed his siblings, dismembering Coyolxauhqui and casting her head into the sky as the moon. This myth was not just a story, it was a worldview. It explained the eternal battle between the sun and the night sky. Every day, Huitzilopochtli fought to rise against darkness. Every sunset was a risk, and every sunrise a victory. But his strength was not infinite. He required nourishment, human hearts, fresh blood, living energy to continue his battle. Without it, the sun would not rise. The darkness would win. The world would end. This fear was not poetic. It was real, constant, and shaped every part of Aztec society. The Aztecs believed they were living in the fifth sun, the fifth age of the world. The previous four had been destroyed, each in a different apocalyptic disaster. One was swallowed by jaguars, another by wind, another by fire, and yet another by water. Each time, the gods had destroyed what they had made, and started again. Now, in this fifth and final era, the responsibility of maintaining the world fell on humans. The gods had created life through their own suffering, by sacrificing themselves, and now humans had to return the favor. It was a debt, a cosmic agreement. To fail in this duty would be to invite the end of time. This belief wasn't limited to the temples or priesthood. It was embedded in daily life. Every ritual, every celebration, every war, every offering of incense or food was done with one thing in mind: to please the gods and hold the apocalypse at bay. But human sacrifice was the ultimate expression of devotion. To offer a human life, especially a strong, young, and unblemished body, was to give the gods something precious, something worthy. Blood was life itself, the most sacred substance, and when it spilled down the temple steps, it was believed to nourish the earth, satisfy the gods, and keep the heavens in motion. The most powerful ceremonies were held in honor of Huitzilopochtli, often during massive festivals. Warriors captured in battle were the most prized victims. They had proven their strength and courage, making their lives more valuable in the eyes of the gods. These captives were paraded through the city, given ceremonial meals, and then, on the appointed day, led to the top of Templo Mayor. There, under the burning sky, priests performed the sacrifice. The heart was torn out and lifted to the sun, the body cast down the pyramid, and the people believed the gods were fed for another day. This ritual was not carried out in darkness or secrecy. It was public, celebrated, and ritualized to the finest detail. The calendar was filled with sacred days dedicated to different gods. One month might be dedicated to Tlaloc, the rain god, another to Tezcatlipoca, the god of fate and conflict. Each deity had their own ceremonies, their own rules, and their own required sacrifices. Tlaloc, for example, preferred the tears of children. During certain festivals, children were dressed in fine clothes, adorned with flowers, and brought to the mountain shrines. There, in the cold wind, they were offered to the god. Their cries were considered a blessing, a sign that Tlaloc would send the rains. The thought of this is heartbreaking today, but to the Aztecs it was love, fear, and faith intertwined. They believed they were doing what was necessary to ensure the survival of their people. Even outside the most extreme rituals, the fear of divine punishment was everywhere. If crops failed, it was not because of weather patterns, it was because the gods were displeased. If disease struck, if enemies attacked, if strange omens appeared in the sky, the cause was spiritual imbalance. Someone had failed in their duties. Someone had angered the gods, and so sacrifices continued, even increased to restore balance. This fear was not paranoia. It was cultural structure. It influenced the way people married, worked, fought, and died. Children were taught from a young age about the gods' powers. Priests studied the stars and read omens to determine the will of the heavens. Even the design of the city mirrored the cosmos, aligning temples with celestial events to please the divine order. Everything had to be in harmony, and when it wasn't, the price was blood. Warfare itself became a form of spiritual obligation. The Aztecs believed that dying in battle or being sacrificed was the most honorable way to die. Those who gave their lives this way would rise again in the afterlife. Some believed they would follow the sun through the sky, others that they would transform into hummingbirds or butterflies, symbols of rebirth. This belief gave warriors extraordinary bravery, and it made the practice of capturing enemies rather than killing them more meaningful. The battlefield was not just about land or power, it was a divine hunt for offerings. Every victory fed the gods. Priests, too, held enormous power and respect. They were not just religious leaders, but scholars, doctors, astronomers, and keepers of history. Their training was intense, often beginning in childhood, and included fasting, self-sacrifice, and memorization of ancient chants and rituals. They were seen as bridges between the mortal world and the divine, the ones who could interpret dreams, read the calendar, and perform the ceremonies that sustained life. Some priests would even practice bloodletting on themselves, cutting their own ears or tongues to offer their blood in daily rituals. Pain was a form of prayer, suffering was communication. The gods, they believed, listened through pain. And yet, despite this dark foundation, the Aztecs were not emotionless. They loved their children, their songs, their festivals. They celebrated births, marriages, and harvests with color and joy. They built schools, created libraries of painted codices, and filled the air with music from flutes and drums. But always, underneath the joy, there was a tension, a sense that the world was fragile, the gods watchful, and the future uncertain. The weight of divine expectation pressed upon them, and they answered it the only way they knew, with devotion, with discipline, and when needed, with death. When the Spanish arrived in the early 16th century, led by Hernán Cortés, they were shocked by what they found. They had come expecting gold and glory, but instead they discovered a city more organized, more populous, and more advanced than any they had imagined. And yet, what haunted them most was not the temples or the treasures. It was the sacrifices. The conquistadors described temples soaked in blood, altars piled with hearts, and the tzompantli skull racks, displaying the remains of hundreds or even thousands of victims. These scenes became symbols of savagery in the eyes of the Europeans, used to justify conquest and destruction. But they did not understand the deeper truth. They saw violence, but missed the fear that fueled it. The Aztecs were not monsters. They were believers, people who lived under the shadow of gods that demanded more than prayers. Today, much of the Aztec world is lost beneath the concrete of modern Mexico City. The great temples have crumbled, the priests are gone, and the sacrifices have ended. But the stories remain. The myths still whisper, and the bones dug up by archaeologists, carefully studied and catalogued, still speak of a people who once believed the world itself would end if they failed to feed the sun. We may never fully understand what it was like to live with such constant fear of cosmic collapse, but in that understanding, or the attempt at it, we find something deeply human, a desire to make sense of the world, a need to protect what we love, and a willingness, however painful, to give what we must to survive. The gods that demanded blood no longer rule the skies, but the memory of them lives on, in the ruins, in the myths, and in the beating hearts of those who remember. For the Aztecs, blood was not just death, it was the essence of life, a gift to the heavens, a song sung in red, and through their sacrifices they believed they were holding the universe together, one life at a time. In the ancient world of the Aztecs, beneath the towering temples and beneath the grandeur of golden palaces and colorful markets, there existed a ritual so terrifying, so brutal, that it still chills the modern imagination. To understand it fully, one must put aside the modern lens of morality and step into a world where the sun itself was believed to be on the verge of dying each day, and the only thing that could keep it alive was the blood of humans. Sacrifice, to the Aztecs, was not murder. It was not cruelty. It was sacred. It was cosmic law. It was a duty as serious as breathing and as necessary as the rising sun. And at the heart of this belief was the horrifying act of human sacrifice. Rituals carried out with precision, symbolism, and a devotion that defied human pain. It was a ceremony unlike anything else in recorded history, a performance of life and death acted out thousands of times under the open sky. The sacrificial ritual began long before the victim was ever led to the temple. For some, the moment their fate was sealed came on the battlefield. Aztec warriors, trained from a young age in combat, did not aim to kill their enemies. They aimed to capture. A captured warrior, alive and strong, was far more valuable than a corpse. He was considered a gift to the gods. Once brought to the capital, he would be treated with a strange duality, honored and doomed. He was dressed in fine garments, fed ceremonial meals, paraded through the streets. In some festivals, he was even worshipped for weeks as an earthly representation of a god. People would bow to him, offer food and sing to him, all the while knowing that at the end of this honor, he would be taken to the temple and sacrificed. These captives were often the primary victims, but they were not the only ones. Slaves, criminals, and in some cases even volunteers, those who offered themselves for glory in the afterlife, were also given to the priests. Children were sacrificed during specific rain festivals. Women were offered to fertility deities. The belief was clear: the more precious the life, the more pleasing the gift. On the day of the ceremony, the city would stir long before the sun rose. Priests, dressed in elaborate feathered headdresses, their bodies painted in black and red, prepared themselves through fasting and ritual purification. The smell of burning copal resin would fill the air. Drums would begin to sound, a slow, deep rhythm that echoed across the plazas and canals. Thousands would gather at the base of the temple, their faces painted, their hearts tense. This was not a private event. It was a performance for the gods and the people alike. The victim, often wearing symbolic costumes, sometimes dressed to resemble the god they were being offered to, was brought forward. 4 assistant priests, known as the Telemakazgi, would seize him by his limbs. Together they ascended the steep steps of the temple, climbing toward the summit, where the altar awaited like a silent stone mouth. At the top, in full view of the crowd and the gods above, the victim was laid on a large, flat stone slab. His arms and legs were stretched and held firmly. The main priest, known as the Tecutli, stood above him, holding a ritual knife made of obsidian, a volcanic glass sharp enough to cut through bone. There was no hesitation. With swift, practiced motion, the priest plunged the knife into the victim's chest, slicing through flesh and ribs until he reached the heart. Blood gushed from the wound. The heart, still beating, was pulled free from the body and held high to the sky. This, the Aztecs believed, was the sun's food. The heart was placed in a ceremonial bowl and sometimes burned or buried in sacred locations. The lifeless body was then cast down the steps of the temple, bouncing and tumbling, its blood streaking the stone as it fell. But this was only one sacrifice. In major festivals, this process was repeated dozens, even hundreds of times in a single day. And in the most extreme ceremonies during the dedication of a new temple or in times of crisis, thousands of victims were killed in a matter of days. According to Spanish accounts, when the great temple of Tenochtitlan was completed, as many as 20,000 people were sacrificed over a 4-day period. While some modern historians debate the accuracy of this number, archaeological evidence and surviving records confirm that large-scale human sacrifice did occur, and in horrifying quantities. The logistics of these ceremonies were staggering. Victims were lined up in queues stretching through the temple courtyards. Multiple priests worked in shifts. Bodies were dragged away, piled or disposed of through carefully practiced systems. In some cases, the bodies were dismembered. In others, their skulls were cleaned, drilled, and added to the sompantli, the skull racks that displayed the remains of the sacrificed. These racks were not symbols of terror to the Aztecs. They were sacred monuments, reminders that their world continued because of sacrifice. The skulls stared outward as warnings to enemies and as offerings to the gods. Not all ceremonies were the same. Some involved more symbolic gestures. In certain festivals, victims were made to dance for days before their deaths. In others, they fought mock battles, armed with wooden swords, while elite warriors surrounded them with real weapons. Their defeat was inevitable. Their death was not punishment. It was prophecy. Some victims were flayed alive, and priests wore their skins in ceremonies to represent rebirth and fertility. Others were drowned, burned, or decapitated, depending on which god was being honored. Each god had preferences. Tlaloc, the rain god, preferred children and tears. Tip-Totec, the flayed god, required his followers to wear the skins of the dead. Tezcatlipoca, the god of fate and illusion, was honored by sacrificing beautiful young men who had lived for a year as his earthly avatar, enjoying luxury and worship, only to die in the final ritual. One of the most elaborate and disturbing rituals was known as the Tlacaxipa, the festival of the flayed one. During this event, captives were dressed in feathers and gold, made to fight warriors in rigged combat, and then sacrificed. Their skins were removed and worn by priests for 20 days as they danced through the city, symbolizing renewal. People would touch the flayed skins, believing it brought fertility and blessings. The line between horror and holiness was blurred in ways almost unimaginable to the modern mind. Even outside the capital, smaller villages performed sacrifices. Some were bloodletting rituals where individuals pierced their ears, tongues, or genitals to offer their own blood. Others followed the grand pattern of the empire, sacrificing prisoners taken in local wars. The Aztec Empire was a network of tribute and fear. Subject peoples were expected to provide not just goods but bodies, living offerings to feed the gods in the heart of Tenochtitlan. This created a constant demand for conflict, expansion, and control. War was ritual, death was currency. And what of the victims? What did they feel? We may never know fully. Some were captives, defeated, and powerless. Others may have believed in the ritual, accepting death as a pathway to divine favor. There are records of individuals volunteering for sacrifice, seeking the honor of giving their life to the gods. The line between execution and elevation was complex. A man whose heart fed the sun was believed to rise again in the afterlife. to follow the sun across the sky, or to live among the stars. In their culture, death on the sacrificial altar could be seen as a gift, both given and received. The scale and brutality of these rituals stunned the Spanish conquistadors. When they witnessed the sacrifices firsthand, many were horrified. They described rivers of blood, hearts still beating in trembling hands, and priests with arms dyed red from endless killing. To the European mind, these acts were monstrous, but they misunderstood. The Aztecs were not cruel for pleasure, they were devoted, and their devotion was rooted in cosmic fear. If they stopped, they believed, the sun would fall, the crops would die, and the world would crumble into darkness. When the Spanish eventually conquered the empire, they destroyed the temples, toppled the idols, and outlawed the sacrifices, but they could not erase the memory. Centuries later, archaeologists would uncover the bones, the altars, and the skull racks buried beneath Mexico City. The truth was deeper than myth. It was carved into stone. Human sacrifice, as horrifying as it seems, was not an aberration. It was the foundation. Today we can stand above the ruins, looking down into the remnants of a civilization that blended beauty and blood in equal measure. We see the obsidian knives displayed in museums, their edges still sharp. We read the codices where priests record the rituals with pride, and we find ourselves caught between awe and horror. For the Aztecs, life and death were two sides of the same blade. To live was to die was to serve, and in their temples under the burning sun they offered everything they had, one heart at a time. In the very heart of what is now Mexico City, beneath the buzzing traffic, the echoing footsteps, and the towering buildings of the modern world, lies the buried skeleton of a temple once feared, once worshipped, once soaked in blood. Long before glass towers and paved roads ruled this land, there stood a pyramid so central, so sacred, and so terrifying, it shaped the rhythm of life and death for an entire empire. This was the Templo Mayor, the great temple of Tenochtitlan, the spiritual center of the Aztec world, and one of the most haunting monuments of ancient Mesoamerica. It was not merely a place of worship, it was a place of sacrifice, a place where the gods were fed, where the people watched, and where thousands of lives ended beneath the open sky. Though the stones have crumbled and time has softened its edges, the whispers of what happened there remain, carried through centuries in stories, skulls, and ruins. The Templo Mayor, translated simply as main temple, was more than a religious building. It was the beating heart of Tenochtitlan, the capital of the Aztec Empire. This massive pyramid rose from the city's center, just steps away from palaces, markets, and canals. Built on an island in the middle of Lake Texcoco, the temple stood as a bridge between earth and heaven. The Aztecs believed this temple was the axis of the universe, the place where the divine met the mortal, where gods descended, and where the fate of the world was decided. Its construction was a colossal achievement, shaped layer by layer across centuries as the empire grew. Each time a new ruler came to power, he expanded or rebuilt the temple, adding to its size, strength, and symbolism. By the early 1500s, just before the arrival of the Spanish conquistadors, the Templo Mayor had become a towering double pyramid with two shrines at its peak, dedicated to two of the Aztecs' most powerful deities, Huitzilopochtli, god of the sun and war, and Tlaloc, god of rain and fertility. Each side of the pyramid reflected the balance the Aztecs sought to maintain: war and peace, fire and water, sun and life. The side dedicated to Huitzilopochtli faced south, where the sun traveled in the sky. The side for Tlaloc faced north, toward the mountains that brought rains. Twin staircases climbed steeply to the top, and at their summit stood two separate temples, each housing the idol of its god. These shrines were not just symbols, they were alive with offerings, chants, incense, and fear. The steps that led to them, wide and imposing, served as stages for the bloodiest rituals known to Aztec culture. Sacrificial ceremonies were conducted at these heights, in full view of the crowds below. The steps were not only walked upon, they were stained red, over and over with the blood of victims offered to the gods. The rituals that took place atop the Templo Mayor were intense, methodical, and rooted in deep belief. During major festivals, especially those celebrating the sun or the coming of rain, victims were led up the staircases, usually 4 at a time, held tightly by assisting priests. Once at the summit, the victim was laid on a curved stone slab specifically designed to stretch the chest upward. A priest, wielding a blade of obsidian, would slice into the chest with terrifying speed and precision, extracting the still-beating heart and holding it toward the sky. The heart would then be placed in a ceremonial dish, while the lifeless body was hurled down the temple steps, tumbling end over end until it reached the base, broken and bloodied. It is said that during the dedication of one version of the Templo Mayor in the late 1400s, as many as 20,000 victims were sacrificed over 4 days. The city turned into a living altar. The smell of blood mixed with incense, the drums echoed like thunder, and the people believed they were witnessing a sacred duty, ensuring the continuation of the world. But this was not an isolated event. Human sacrifice was a regular, ritualized part of Aztec life, and the Templo Mayor stood at the center of it all. Every month, according to the Aztec calendar, brought a new festival, a new deity to honor, and new lives to offer. Some ceremonies focused on warriors, others on children, others still on captured slaves or criminals. But the great temple remained the constant sight, the mountain from which blood flowed like rivers, washing across stone steps, worn smooth by centuries of death. Priests walked barefoot across these stones, their feet coated in red, their bodies were often stained with dried blood, their hair clumped with ash, their faces hidden behind masks. For the people below, watching these ceremonies was not horrifying, it was spiritual, it was necessary. If the gods were not fed, they believed the sun would not rise, the rain would not fall, crops would wither, the earth itself might crack open and swallow them all. Death was the cost of life, and the Templo Mayor was where that price was paid. The design of the temple reflected this ideology. Archaeological excavations have revealed that the temple was rebuilt at least 7 times, with each new ruler layering a new pyramid over the old one. This left behind a kind of architectural time capsule, older temples hidden inside newer ones, each one filled with offerings of gold, jade, obsidian, human remains, and elaborate stone carvings. In 1978, a major discovery transformed what we know about the Templo Mayor. While workers were digging in downtown Mexico City, they uncovered a massive stone carving, the Coyolxauhqui stone, depicting the dismembered body of the moon goddess. This discovery led to the excavation of the temple's ruins, which had long been hidden beneath colonial buildings. What archaeologists found shocked even the most seasoned experts. They uncovered walls lined with human skulls, arranged neatly in patterns. They found pits filled with sacrificed children, their bones carefully placed in ceremonial positions. They found massive offering caches, hundreds of items including animal bones, sea creatures, jade masks, flutes made from human bones, and obsidian knives still sharp enough to cut. And most disturbingly, they found the remains of what appeared to be mass human sacrifices. Bodies with chest cavities shattered open, bones cut cleanly at the joints, skulls drilled for mounting. These were not the results of random violence. They were deliberate, systematic, religious offerings. Some skulls bore the marks of having been displayed on the Sumpantli, the skull racks that stood beside the temple. These racks, made of wooden beams, held the pierced skulls of the sacrificed, often numbering in the thousands. Spanish accounts from the 16th century describe seeing more than 100,000 skulls at the temple precinct. Though this number is debated, the archaeological evidence confirms that large-scale skull displays did indeed exist. Even more chilling was the discovery of a massive circular tower made entirely of human skulls known as the Huitzilopochtli. Unearthed near the Templo Mayor, this tower contained over 600 skulls, many of them from young men, women, and even children. The skulls were mortared together, forming a vertical monument to sacrifice. This was not a hidden feature of the temple. It was placed prominently, meant to be seen, to be honored, to be feared. It reminded everyone, citizens and enemies alike, that the gods watched constantly, and that the people of Tenochtitlan would stop at nothing to keep them satisfied. The grandeur and terror of the Templo Mayor did not go unnoticed by the Spanish. When Hernán Cortés and his men entered Tenochtitlan in 1519, they were stunned. They had seen cathedrals and castles in Europe, but nothing prepared them for the sights of the Aztec capital. They were welcomed into the city, allowed to climb the steps of the great temple, and there they witnessed the blood-stained altars, the piles of offerings, the fetid scent of death and incense lingering in the air. They saw firsthand the obsidian knives, the heartstones, the skull racks, and the sacrifices. Though they claimed to be horrified, they also recognized the power that such rituals held over the people. When the conquest began in earnest, one of their first acts was to dismantle the temple, topple the idols, and erect a Christian cathedral on its ruins. But even as they tried to bury the Aztec past, the blood had already seeped into the stone. Centuries later, archaeologists continue to unearth the stories that the temple has kept hidden. Every offering, every bone, every carved serpent or shattered skull tells a story of a civilization that reached for the heavens with one hand and held a blade in the other. The Templo Mayor was not just a structure, it was a symbol, a reminder that for the Aztecs, the sacred and the savage were never far apart. In their eyes, they were not monsters. They were protectors of cosmic balance, and every life taken at the temple steps was given, not taken, offered freely to keep the sun burning, the rain falling, and the world from crumbling into chaos. Now, as tourists walk the streets of modern Mexico City, most have no idea what lies beneath their feet. A few steps away from busy restaurants and busy traffic, you can stand above the ruins of the Templo Mayor, look down into the exposed stones and try to imagine the sounds, the drums, the chants, the screams, the silence after the sacrifice. The temple is quiet now, but it has not forgotten. Its stones have soaked up too much to ever forget. They remember the feet of the priests, the weight of the victims, the warmth of blood, and the unshakable faith of a people who believed that death was not the end, but the fuel that kept the universe alive. In the heart of the Aztec capital, amid the grandeur of towering temples, floating gardens, bustling marketplaces, and echoing ceremonial chants, stood something far more haunting than even the blood-soaked steps of the great temple. It was a structure that froze visitors in awe and terror, a monument not to glory or beauty, but to death, known as the Tzompantli, or skull rack. This grisly display of human remains was one of the most chilling symbols of Aztec religious power and imperial dominance. It stood outside the sacred precinct of Tenochtitlan's Templo Mayor, built with wood and stone, but decorated with the pierced skulls of countless sacrificial victims. Each skull once held a name, a beating heart, a final scream lost to the wind. And yet here they were, stripped of identity, mounted in rows, stacked into towers, silent offerings to the gods, and unmistakable warnings to all who saw them. This was not hidden from public view. The Tzompantli was made to be seen, to be feared, to be remembered. To the Aztecs, death was not an end but a necessary step in the cosmic cycle. Human sacrifice was a sacred duty, and the skulls left behind were not thrown away. They were treasured, preserved, and displayed as testaments to divine balance. The Tzompantli was more than a gruesome art piece. It was a deeply spiritual construction. Its presence outside major temples like the Templo Mayor signaled the holy purpose of the killings that had taken place. Skulls were taken from victims whose hearts had been cut out atop the pyramid, their bodies tumbled down the stairs, and their heads brought to the priests who would prepare them for mounting. Holes were drilled into the sides of the skulls, allowing them to be threaded onto horizontal wooden poles like beads on a necklace. These poles were then fixed onto vertical frames, forming rows upon rows, layer after layer, of human heads staring out over the sacred square. Over time, these skull racks were added to and expanded, with older skulls removed and replaced, some weathering to dust while others were carefully mortared into circular stone towers. To modern minds, the idea of displaying skulls publicly feels macabre and nightmarish. But in the Aztec world, it was a form of reverence. Each skull was proof of a life given to feed the gods. Each face, now reduced to bone, had once looked into the eyes of a priest, perhaps with fear, perhaps with peace. Now they looked upon the people who came to worship, to celebrate, to mourn. The skull racks became not just religious icons but political tools. For the citizens of Tenochtitlan, they reminded everyone of their sacred duty to uphold the cycle of sacrifice. For enemies and visitors, they were terrifying symbols of Aztec power and might. Approach this city, the skulls seemed to say, and know what fate awaits those who challenge the empire. This was psychological warfare, public terror fused with theology. Spanish conquistadors were both mesmerized and horrified when they encountered the Tzompantli. Bernal Diaz del Castillo, a soldier in Cortés' expedition, wrote in his chronicles of seeing tens of thousands of skulls displayed in the Great Square. He described long racks of bones stretching out like fences, some with fresh skulls still dripping with blood, others bleached white by sun and time. The Spaniards, having never seen such a spectacle in their own churches or battlefields, struggled to comprehend it. To them this was proof of savagery, of barbarism so deep it could not be tolerated. But to the Aztecs, it was holiness. It was structure. It was faith, carved in bone. The skulls told stories. They told of war, of ritual, of duty, of divine hunger. And they reminded every person in the city, noble, priest or farmer, that the gods were watching and the balance must be maintained at any cost. For centuries, much of the evidence of the Tzompantli was lost to time. When the Spanish conquered Tenochtitlan in 1521, they quickly began dismantling the temples, smashing the idols, and building Catholic churches on top of sacred Aztec ground. The skull racks were destroyed, their wood rotted or burned, the bones buried or discarded. All that remained were the stories, eyewitness accounts written in horror, and indigenous codices painted with symbols few could read. Some scholars debated whether the skull towers were exaggerated, mythologized by the Spaniards to justify their conquest. After all, what kind of civilization could decorate its capital with thousands of human heads? But history, as it often does, left traces behind. In 2015, deep beneath the modern streets of Mexico City, archaeologists working near the ruins of Templo Mayor made a shocking discovery. While excavating a colonial-era building, they uncovered a circular stone structure, strange, deliberate, and filled with skulls. As they dug deeper, the number grew. 50 skulls, 100, then more. By the time they had fully uncovered it, they had found more than 600 human skulls, mortared together into a single towering monument. It was not a myth. The Huey Tzompantli, the Great Skull Rack, had been real all along, and now it stood again, not in its full height, but in its haunting truth. This tower of skulls was constructed with precision. The skulls were not dumped in piles but arranged in clean horizontal and vertical rows. They faced outward, forming a ring of human faces staring forever into the space around them. Archaeologists were stunned not just by the size but by the variety. Among the skulls were those of adult men, yes, but also women and even children. This contradicted the long-held assumption that only captured male warriors were sacrificed. The presence of women and children suggests a more complex and disturbing picture, one where multiple gods were fed and sacrifices were tailored for different divine appetites. It also confirmed what ancient texts had always whispered, that human sacrifice was deeply embedded in all levels of society, touching families, festivals, and seasons. The preservation of the skulls provided further insight. Some bore clear holes in their sides, proof they had once been strung on wooden poles before being incorporated into the stone tower. Others showed signs of ritual cleaning, as if prepared not as garbage but as offerings. The teeth, the eye sockets, The grooves worn into bone, every detail told a story. This was not senseless slaughter. It was a carefully managed system of spiritual debt. The Aztecs believed the gods had sacrificed themselves to create the universe. Now humanity had to return the favor. Each skull in that tower was a repayment, a ritual coin in the currency of survival. Standing before the ruins today, it's hard to imagine what it must have felt like centuries ago, walking into the sacred plaza of Tenochtitlan and seeing the skull rack gleaming in the sun. Thousands of skulls, drying and darkening with age, rattling gently in the wind, the scent of incense mixing with the coppery air of old blood. It would not have felt like a graveyard. It would have felt like a temple, a place where life was laid bare, where the face of death watched you silently, reminding you that your blood might one day join the stream that fed the gods. And for the people of the city, this was not horror. It was meaning. It was order. The presence of death was not hidden away behind closed doors or stone walls. It was present, visible, sacred. The discovery of the Huitzilopochtli has changed how modern historians understand the Aztec world. It confirms that large-scale human sacrifice was not only real, but celebrated. It shows that death was as much a part of Aztec architecture as stone and mortar. The very layout of Tenochtitlan was built to support ritual, the temples for sacrifice, the platforms for performance, the skull racks for remembrance. These were not disconnected parts. They were all pieces of a single terrifyingly beautiful worldview. A world in which the sun rose not on hope or peace, but on blood. A world where gods were not pleased with song alone. They wanted flesh, bone, and the spark of life that only a beating heart could give. For many, the existence of the Skull Tower still feels unbelievable. We want to see ancient civilizations as noble, wise, spiritual, but not brutal. And yet, the Aztecs were all of those things at once. They built floating gardens, understood astronomy, composed poetry, and created stunning art. But they also cut open thousands of chests, spilled blood on temple steps, and mounted skulls like decorations. This duality is hard to accept, but it is real, and it forces us to ask deeper questions about what people are capable of in the name of faith, about how far we will go to please unseen gods, and about how we choose to remember those who have been silenced by time. Now, as you walk through the museum built over the ruins of Templo Mayor, you can stand before the remains of the Skull Tower. The faces, though made of bone, still hold something human, eye sockets that once saw the sky, teeth that once spoke or cried, skulls that once held dreams, memories, fears. They are silent now, but in that silence they still speak. They tell us of a people who believed the world could end at any moment, unless they gave everything. They tell us of rituals older than kings, older than cities. They tell us that belief, when shaped by fear and sacred obligation, can build pyramids, topple empires, and fill towers with the bones of the faithful. And perhaps, as the sun sets behind the modern skyline of Mexico City, casting long shadows over streets that lie above those ancient stones, the whisper of the Tzompantli still rises with the evening wind, not as a scream, but as a memory of a time when death was divine, and the skulls of the dead looked out not in warning, but in worship, in the shadow of the mighty temples of Tenochtitlan, where human hearts were offered to the gods under the open sky and blood flowed like a sacred river down the stone steps. Another rumor emerged, one even darker, even more unsettling. It came not from the Aztecs themselves, but from the mouths of their conquerors. Spanish conquistadors, shocked by what they witnessed, claimed that the Aztecs not only sacrificed their victims, but ate them. The idea horrified Europe. Here was a people who, by all accounts, built grand cities, developed astronomy, composed poetry, and governed with order. Yet beneath their brilliance, the Spaniards insisted, they indulged in cannibalism, ritualistic, systematic, and spiritual. Whether this was truth or propaganda remains a subject of fierce debate, But the very notion that such a powerful civilization might feast on the flesh of the dead has lingered for centuries, casting a long, eerie shadow over the memory of the Aztec Empire. When Hernán Cortés and his men arrived in the Valley of Mexico in 1519, they were awestruck by the scale and sophistication of Tenochtitlan. They saw gardens floating on lakes, temples that touched the clouds, markets bustling with trade, and palaces filled with gold. But they also witnessed the ritual sacrifice of human beings, beating hearts ripped from chests, bodies flung down pyramids, and skulls displayed like trophies. These acts alone were enough to disturb the Spaniards, whose Christian values clashed violently with the Aztec worldview. But the most disturbing claims came later, written in letters, journals, and colonial chronicles. In these texts, the Spaniards described scenes of Aztec priests and nobles taking parts of the sacrificed bodies, arms, thighs, sometimes entire torsos, and roasting them, seasoning them, and serving them at feasts. The meat, they said, was eaten during sacred banquets, shared among elites, and consumed not out of hunger, but out of spiritual duty. According to these reports, the victims were treated not just as offerings to the gods, but as sacred meals shared with the living. Such claims were repeated by multiple sources. Bernal Diaz del Castillo, a soldier under Cortés, wrote of entire homes decorated with human bones and of priests who dined on the flesh of those they had sacrificed. The Spanish chronicler Andrés de Tapia claimed that human flesh was sold in the markets of Tenochtitlan, priced according to body part. These stories painted a picture of horror, of a civilization not only ruled by death but nourished by it. To the Spanish crown, these tales served a purpose. They reinforced the idea that the Aztecs were not just pagans, they were monsters, and monsters, of course, deserved conquest. But not all modern scholars accept these accounts at face value. In recent decades, historians and archaeologists have questioned the accuracy and motivation behind the Spanish reports. Was Aztec cannibalism truly widespread, or was it exaggerated, perhaps even fabricated, by conquerors eager to justify their brutal campaign? After all, portraying the Aztecs as cannibals would make the destruction of their temples and the forced conversion of their people not only acceptable but righteous. It would frame the conquest as a divine mission to save souls from savagery. The controversy lies in the evidence, or lack of it. While Spanish texts describe scenes of cannibalistic feasts in vivid detail, archaeological proof remains elusive. Excavations at Aztec temples have unearthed thousands of human bones, many of them showing signs of sacrifice, dismemberment, and ritual handling. But signs of cannibalism such as burn marks, cut patterns consistent with butchering, or human remains found in cooking vessels are much rarer. A few sites have suggested possible signs of human flesh being roasted or boiled, but the interpretations remain debated. Some argue that these marks could come from ritual preparation, not consumption. Others believe they may have been isolated incidents rather than widespread cultural practices. Still, the Aztecs themselves provide some hints. In the few surviving indigenous codices, pictorial manuscripts created by the Aztecs, there are images that depict human limbs being prepared in pots or presented on plates. One famous codex shows a priest presenting a cooked thigh to another figure, believed to be a noble or ruler. But even these images are symbolic and open to interpretation. Were they literal depictions of cannibalism, or metaphorical representations of offering and transformation? In Aztec culture, the act of sacrifice was deeply intertwined with ideas of regeneration and rebirth. Eating a piece of a sacrificed body may have symbolized spiritual communion with the gods, much like how Christians consume bread and wine as the body and blood of Christ. There is also the matter of Aztec diet. Unlike many other ancient civilizations, the Aztecs lacked large domesticated animals for meat. There were no cattle, sheep, or pigs in Mesoamerica before the arrival of the Spanish. Their protein sources came from beans, insects, turkeys, and small animals like dogs. Some scholars have speculated that cannibalism may have served a dietary function, providing meat when other sources were scarce. But this theory, known as the protein deficiency hypothesis, has largely fallen out of favor. Modern analysis of Aztec agriculture and food systems shows they had enough protein through a diverse and balanced diet. If cannibalism existed, it likely wasn't driven by hunger. It was something else entirely: spiritual, symbolic, terrifying. What cannot be denied is the role that these stories played in shaping the image of the Aztecs across the world. The idea of ritual cannibalism has long fascinated and horrified historians, writers, and the general public. It reinforced the image of the Aztecs as both magnificent and monstrous, a people who built cities in the clouds and fed their gods with flesh. This paradox has captivated generations. The Spaniards, intentionally or not, crafted a narrative that would outlive the empire itself. And even today, when we hear the word Aztec, the mind often conjures images of sacrifice, blood, and cannibalistic feasts beneath a burning sun. The truth, as always, is more complex. It's possible that cannibalism did occur in specific rituals, limited to priesthoods or warrior societies, and steeped in spiritual meaning. It's also possible that the Spanish exaggerated what they saw or misunderstood it entirely. Perhaps they mistook symbolic acts for literal ones, or perhaps in their fear and cultural bias, they interpreted every bone and fire as evidence of savagery. After all, cultural misunderstanding runs deep. The Spaniards could not comprehend a civilization where death was sacred and sacrifice was salvation. What they called barbaric, the Aztecs called holy. What they condemned, the Aztecs celebrated. There are also indigenous sources that lend some weight to the cannibalism claims. In the centuries after the conquest, Christianized Aztec writers, such as Bernardino de Sahagún's native informants, confirmed that human flesh was sometimes consumed after sacrifices. They described specific rituals where the flesh of sacrificial victims was eaten by high-ranking nobles or priests. These acts were framed as extensions of devotion, ceremonies that honored the gods and absorbed their power. The flesh was not eaten casually or widely. It was reserved for rare, controlled, ritual moments. This lends some credibility to the Spanish accounts, while also suggesting they may have been distorted over time. One cannot ignore the power that such stories had and still have. The image of a priest cutting out a heart, roasting the limbs, and serving them to the elite is unforgettable. It evokes both horror and awe. It makes the Aztec world feel alien and terrifying. And perhaps that's the point. In constructing the Aztecs as cannibals, history framed them as the ultimate other. They were advanced, yes, but also deeply disturbing. The stories ensured that the Aztec Empire would be remembered not just for its achievements, but for its darkness. Yet, to truly understand the Aztecs, we must resist the urge to reduce them to just their bloodiest myths. They were astronomers, artists, engineers, poets, warriors, and visionaries. They built one of the most complex and successful civilizations in the Americas. Their calendar rivaled the precision of the Mayans. Their marketplaces served hundreds of thousands. Their floating gardens fed a city of millions. And yes, they believed in sacrifice. They believed the world was fragile, always on the edge of collapse, and that life itself required life in return. If cannibalism was part of that system, it was not about cruelty. It was about connection between humans and gods, between death and rebirth, between flesh and the divine. Today, as archaeologists continue to unearth the ruins of Tenochtitlan, every stone and bone helps us see the Aztecs more clearly, not as monsters but as people with dreams, fears, rituals, and beliefs that shaped everything they did. People who saw the world not in black and white, but in a spectrum of sacred obligations. The question of cannibalism remains unresolved, hanging in the air like incense over a forgotten altar. But perhaps the truth lies not in whether it happened often, but in why it mattered at all. Because whether the Aztecs consumed the flesh of their victims or not, what we do know is this: they lived in a world where the line between life and death, between man and God, was thin. and always trembling. In the vibrant, pulsating heart of the Aztec Empire, life revolved not around weeks or weekends, but around gods, rituals, and sacred time. Theirs was a world where every passing day carried divine weight, and every month came with obligations to the forces that governed the universe. Their calendar was not just a system of dates, it was a cosmic blueprint. It shaped farming, war, governance, and above all, sacrifice. The Aztec ritual calendar, known as the tonal pohole, was a 260-day sacred cycle used to schedule festivals, divinations, and offerings. Alongside it ran the 365-day Sifahoali, a solar calendar divided into 18 months of 20 days each, with 5 nameless days considered dangerous, unlucky, and chaotic. Together, these calendars governed everything, and within them lived some of the most chilling, awe-inspiring festivals the ancient world has ever known. To the Aztecs, time itself was alive. Days had personalities, gods, and destinies. Time did not pass meaninglessly. It demanded participation. It demanded offerings. The gods had created the world not out of kindness, but through their own sacrifices. And now, the people had to repay that debt, day by day, month by month, through ritual and blood. Each of the 18 months on the Aztec calendar was marked by a major festival, and many of them required human sacrifice. These weren't small, secretive ceremonies. They were public, orchestrated spectacles attended by thousands, priests dressed as gods, drums thundered through temple plazas, dancers in jaguar skins and feathered cloaks moved in hypnotic circles. Incense curled through the air, blending with the scent of sweat, flowers, and blood. At the center of it all were the victims, captives of war, slaves bought for the occasion, and in some rare cases, volunteers prepared from childhood for this fate. Their role was not seen as tragic. It was divine. They were bridges between humans and gods. One of the most disturbing festivals in the Aztec calendar was Tlacaxapahuilzli, often translated as the flaying of men. Held in the second month of the solar year, this festival honored 2 major deities, Paitotec, the god of spring, agriculture, and renewal, and also the god of suffering, disease, and war. But the way this god was celebrated reveals just how far the Aztecs were willing to go to please their divine patrons. The name Tlacaxapahuilzli comes from the Nahuatl words for flaying and wearing the skin of others, and that is exactly what the rituals entailed. In preparation for the festival, captured warriors from enemy cities were kept alive, sometimes for months. They were treated well, fed and honored, knowing full well what their fate would be. When the time came, they were paraded through the streets, painted and adorned like gods. Then, atop the Templo Mayor, or another ceremonial pyramid, the sacrifices began. The victims were taken to the summit, laid across the sacrificial stone, and their hearts were cut out in full view of the crowd. But that was only the beginning. After the heart was offered, the bodies were taken down and flayed, carefully stripped of their skin from head to toe. These skins were not discarded. They were sacred. Priests would wear them for days, walking through the city as if they were the god Ixipetotec himself, renewed through death and rebirth. It was a haunting sight. The skins were loose, bloodied, and still warm. Through the eye holes, the priest's own eyes stared out silently. The ritual was both horrifying and symbolic. Just as corn sheds its husk to reveal new life, the flayed skins represented the old being cast aside so that growth could begin. The city became a walking landscape of death and fertility combined, where death was not the end, but a passage to new beginnings. The skins were believed to hold power. They were worn during dances, kept in shrines, even offered to the sick to bring healing. But no matter how symbolic the act may have been, the physical reality was undeniable. This was a festival of flesh, and Tlacaxapahuilzli was just one of many. Another major festival, Toxcatl, took place during the dry season and honored Tezcatlipoca, the smoking mirror god of fate, night, and power. For this festival, A young man was chosen a full year in advance. He was selected not for punishment, but for honor. He was to represent the god on earth. During that year, he was treated as a living deity, dressed in fine clothes, taught to play the flute, walk with dignity, and behave with nobility. People bowed to him in the streets. He had attendants. He was the embodiment of Tezcatlipoca himself. But at the end of that year, his divine role reached its climax. On the day of the festival, the god-man walked through the city one last time, playing his flute, saying goodbye to the people who worshipped him. He climbed the temple steps voluntarily, and there, without protest, he was sacrificed. His body was then carefully handled, his bones used in further rituals, and his death was said to guarantee fortune for the year to come. These rituals weren't limited to individuals. Sometimes entire groups were sacrificed together. During the festival of Panquetzilisti, dedicated to the sun god Huitzilopochtli, mass sacrifices were common. Prisoners captured in battle were arranged in lines, taken to the temple in shifts, and sacrificed in one sweeping ceremony. Drums beat rhythmically. Priests worked in unison. The sun was believed to be especially hungry during this month, and only a river of blood would satisfy it. To the Aztecs, this was an act of cosmic nourishment. To stop would be to risk everything. The sun might not rise, crops might not grow, and life could collapse into chaos. The Aztec calendar did not shy away from these realities. Instead, it embraced them. Each month brought its own flavor of ritual. Some required fasting, others required dancing, others demanded offerings of flowers, incense, and animals. But a significant number required blood, and not metaphorical blood. Real, human blood. The calendar was both a spiritual schedule and a sacrifice planner. Priests used it to calculate when gods needed attention, when the veil between worlds was thinnest, and when death could best serve the living. The city itself moved in rhythm with the calendar. When a festival approached, entire neighborhoods prepared altars, costumes, songs, and foods. Children learned the rituals early. The sick prayed for healing. Warriors prepared to die with honor. And somewhere in the priesthood, the names of the chosen victims were whispered, their fates sealed by the sacred numbers of the calendar wheel. Even ordinary people participated in self-sacrifice. During certain festivals, men and women would pierce their tongues, ears, or genitals, offering their own blood to the gods. The idea was not to die, but to bleed, to feel the pain that mirrored the god's own suffering. Blood was life, and life was the most precious thing one could give. This was the core belief that saturated every day of the Aztec calendar. The world was born from sacrifice, sustained by sacrifice, and destined to end if sacrifice ever ceased. What is perhaps most chilling is the scale of these ceremonies. Spanish chroniclers wrote of seeing thousands of victims sacrificed in a single festival. Whether these numbers were exaggerated or not, we now know that mass sacrifices did occur. Excavations at the Templo Mayor and other sacred sites have uncovered evidence of large-scale killings, piles of bones, mass graves, ceremonial knives, and signs of organized ritual slaughter. One offering pit contained over 40 children sacrificed to Tlaloc, the rain god, during a season of drought. Their bodies were buried with care, but their expressions, frozen in time, tell of terror and suffering. Some still wore necklaces or carried tiny toys. These were not criminals or warriors. They were offerings. Their tears, it was believed, would call down rain. This willingness to sacrifice anything, warriors, slaves, children, even oneself, was born from fear and faith. The Aztecs did not believe the gods would punish them out of anger or vengeance. Rather, they believed that without constant offerings the gods would weaken and perish. And if the gods perished, so would the world. It was not a punishment. It was entropy, a cosmic collapse. Only through sacrifice could the balance be maintained. Time, in this view, was not linear. It was circular, a wheel that needed to be turned with blood. Even the end of the calendar cycle brought anxiety. Every 52 years, when the solar and sacred calendars aligned, the Aztecs believed the universe was especially vulnerable. the gods might decide to destroy the world again, as they had done 4 times before. During this period, called the New Fire Ceremony, all fires across the empire were extinguished. Darkness reigned. People destroyed household items, broke statues and fasted. Priests climbed a mountain near the city and waited. If the stars moved in the right way, they would light a new fire on the chest of a sacrificed victim. That flame would be carried down to reignite every hearth in the land. The people would rejoice. The world had been spared again. But the tension before that moment, the silence, the uncertainty that was the price of living under a calendar governed by gods who demanded blood. Today, as historians and archaeologists continue to study the Aztec calendar, its meaning becomes clearer. It was not just a method of marking time. It was a living, breathing force. It dictated life's rhythm. It fed the gods. It reminded the people of their place in a fragile universe. The festivals were not random acts of cruelty. They were the keystones of Aztec civilization, chilling, beautiful, terrifying, and deeply spiritual. Through them, the Aztecs believed they could keep the stars aligned, the rains falling, the sun rising, and for that, they gave everything. Now, centuries later, the calendar stones still sit in museums. The carved faces of gods stare out across the glass. The festivals are gone, the temples in ruins, the drums silenced. But if you look closely, if you read the inscriptions, you can still see the shape of time as the Aztecs saw it. A wheel spinning through blood, a song sung in pain and praise, a calendar written in sacrifice. In the grand, bustling streets of Tenochtitlan, life moved in rhythm with drums that echoed across the sacred lake. Merchants haggled in the sprawling market square. Farmers tended chinampas, floating gardens of green that fed the great city. Artisans shaped obsidian into blades, feathers into headdresses, and stone into idols. Children laughed, priests chanted, warriors marched. On the surface it was a city of brilliance, an empire teeming with order, art, and innovation. But beneath the surface of this daily life lay a truth so profound, so constant, that it shaped every breath of every citizen. The Aztec world was obsessed with death. It was not feared. It was not mourned. It was worshipped, revered, and integrated into the fabric of existence. In the Aztec Empire, death was not the end. It was purpose. It was offering. It was divine. For ordinary citizens, death was never far. The pyramids stood high above the neighborhoods, their blood-stained steps visible from nearly every angle of the city. Ritual sacrifices happened in public, during festivals and ceremonies attended by thousands. It wasn't strange. It wasn't hidden. It was part of life. The people believed the gods had sacrificed themselves to create the world. Now the world survived only through repayment, through the offering of blood, hearts, and flesh. This belief was not whispered. It was taught from the moment a child could understand words. Children grew up knowing that to bleed was to serve, that to die on the altar was to be honored, not pitied. They saw the victims not as helpless or condemned, but as chosen ones, destined to please the gods and keep the universe in balance. A child in the Aztec world learned early that pain had meaning. Tiny fingers would offer flowers or insects at household shrines. By adolescence, some would learn to pierce their ears, tongues, or legs with thorns or sharpened bone, offering drops of their own blood during ceremonies. This wasn't done in secret corners. It was done in public, among family, in community, under the watchful eyes of the gods. Parents encouraged bravery in the face of pain, not to harden the heart, but to purify the soul. Every drop was a gift, every wound a prayer. And if a child died young, it wasn't just sorrow, it was a blessing. Infants and children who died were believed to go to the paradise of Tlaloc, the rain god, a place of eternal greenery and peace. Death, even accidental or early, carried spiritual value. It had meaning. Adults lived with the awareness that death might arrive not only by accident or war, but by ritual selection. Some were slaves bought specifically for sacrifice. Others were warriors captured in battle, but even free citizens sometimes volunteered, believing that a glorious death on the temple steps would bring honor to their family and secure their place in the afterlife. To be chosen was frightening, yes, but also exalting. People fasted, purified themselves, and offered prayers in hopes of being accepted by the gods. Life in the Aztec Empire was not about avoiding death. It was about aligning yourself with it, preparing for it, and giving it meaning when it came. The most honored deaths were those that mirrored the divine. Warriors who died in battle or were sacrificed after capture were said to follow the sun into the sky, becoming its companions for 4 years before returning to Earth as hummingbirds and butterflies. Women who died in childbirth received equal glory, for they too had battled for life. Their spirits were powerful, feared and respected, believed to walk with the sunset and influence storms and disease. Death was not a punishment. It was a transformation. And so, as people walked the streets of Tenochtitlan, they did so with pride, knowing their lives, however long or short, were part of a sacred story. Even ordinary professions were tied to the cycle of death. Farmers made offerings to the earth gods before planting and harvesting, sometimes sacrificing birds or small animals to nourish the soil. Builders placed tiny burials beneath foundations, bones of animals or sometimes children, to bless the structure and protect it. Midwives who delivered babies invoked spirits of death and life simultaneously, for birth and death were never separate. Hunters offered thanks to the spirits of slain animals, recognizing the cycle they too were part of. Nothing was done without ceremony. Every action carried weight. Every breath was watched by the divine. Festivals were the heartbeat of society, and almost all of them revolved around sacrifice. For entire months, communities would prepare costumes, dances, songs, and altars. Families gathered together to witness the great rituals. Vendors sold food and drink to crowds who watched as victims were led to the temples. Drums pounded, flutes sang, priests in elaborate robes ascended the steps. And when the sacrifice was performed, when the knife plunged, when the heart was lifted to the sky, when the body tumbled down the stairs, it wasn't met with horror, it was met with reverence. The people bowed, they wept, they thanked the gods. They did not run, they did not turn away. This was not death as punishment, it was death as beauty. Children learned to reenact these rituals in play. Wooden knives, clay temples, and dolls were used in ceremonial games that mimicked the adult world. In school, boys were taught to be warriors and expected to show courage. Girls were taught domestic rituals, weaving, and childbirth prayers. Even play was sacred. It prepared them for their future roles in a society that thrived on spiritual sacrifice. Elders told stories of gods who had bled for creation, of ancestors who had risen to the stars. Myths were not just bedtime tales. They were instructions on how to live and how to die. The fear of divine punishment also loomed large. The Aztecs believed the world had already ended 4 times. Earthquakes, floods, and monsters had wiped out entire ages. Now they lived in the 5th and final sun, a fragile, fleeting world kept alive only through devotion. If the gods were displeased, the sun might stop, the rain might vanish, the stars might fall. Every ritual was designed to prevent this. And so daily life was filled with prayers, chants, incense, bloodletting, and offerings. A baker might whisper thanks before kneading dough. A fisherman might toss the first catch back to the lake. A teacher might lead morning chants before lessons. The divine was everywhere. The gods walked among them, not in mystery but in routine. The city itself reflected this devotion. Everywhere were images of gods, carved into doorways, painted onto walls, embedded in stone pavements. Statues lined courtyards, each with a story, a power, a hunger. The smell of copal incense drifted through the streets. Flowers, blood, and bones were common offerings, placed in tiny shrines at every corner. Even the great market, where tens of thousands traded each day, had its own temple where merchants prayed for good luck and protection. The economic and spiritual were not separate. They flowed together, like rivers into the same sea. Punishments too were religious. A thief might be sacrificed to a god of justice. A liar might be publicly shamed before an altar. Laws were strict, but not arbitrary. They were believed to reflect divine order. Justice, like death, was sacred. Family life followed the same rhythm. Parents taught children to live humbly, to honor the gods, and to accept pain. There were songs for birth, for death, for planting, for sacrifice. Even meals began with whispered words to the spirits. The home itself was considered a sacred space, and when a loved one died, whether by old age, illness, accident, or sacrifice, the family did not wail. They offered food, burned incense, and sent prayers to guide the spirit into the next world. Mourning was not despair, it was sacred duty. The Aztecs understood that fear could coexist with reverence. Many feared the gods, not because they were evil, but because they were powerful, unpredictable, and necessary. Lightning, drought, eclipse, plague, these were signs the gods were restless, so the people lived attentively, not with panic, but with devotion. Sacrifice was not performed for cruelty. It was performed to prevent cruelty from the skies, from the earth, from time itself. The people believed they were stewards of cosmic balance, and every act of ritual, even if it involved death, was an attempt to hold the world together. From the outside, this may seem bleak, but within the Aztec worldview, it was beautiful. Death was not the enemy. Forgetting the gods, that was the true danger. To die in ritual was to be remembered forever. To die in sacrifice was to become light in the sky. The stars were the bones of ancestors. The sun was powered by hearts. The rain was called forth by the tears of sacrificed children. Nothing in nature moved without the blood of the faithful. And so, in this death-obsessed society, people lived fully. They laughed, they danced, they loved. They worked hard, dreamed big, and raised families. But always with the awareness that life was a gift on loan, and someday the gods would call it back. Even now, centuries later, the ruins of Tenochtitlan sleep beneath the streets of Mexico City. Tourists walk above them, unaware of the layers of sacrifice beneath their feet. Museums display the artifacts, knives, skulls, statues, but the true heartbeat of that world was in the people who lived each day with death as their neighbor. They did not run from it. They embraced it. And in doing so, they built a civilization whose memory still echoes in stone, in story, and in the wind. In the year 1519, as the great city of Tenochtitlan shimmered in the sunlight, alive with markets, temples, and towering pyramids, the people of the Aztec Empire had no idea that the end of their world had already begun. That year, Hernán Cortés stepped onto the shores of the Yucatan Peninsula with a few hundred Spanish soldiers, hungry for gold and glory. Behind them were steel weapons, gunpowder, foreign gods, and diseases unknown to the land. The Aztecs believed time moved in cycles, creation followed by destruction. And now, unknowingly, they stood at the edge of their final cycle. But when the dust of conquest finally settled, a haunting question would remain: had terror ended, or had it simply changed shape? At the heart of the Aztec Empire was not just power, but belief, a sacred bond between people and gods, kept alive through daily offerings, bloodletting, and sacrifice. The Aztecs believed that without their devotion, the sun might not rise, the rain might not fall, and the world would end in darkness. Every ritual had meaning, every festival a purpose. This worldview gave structure to their society, but also justified unspeakable violence. Human sacrifice was not cruelty, it was cosmic necessity. Thousands were sacrificed to nourish the gods. Skulls lined temple walls. Bodies were flayed, hearts torn out in public. Blood flowed down stone steps. The Spanish were horrified by what they saw. But were they truly shocked, or just eager to paint the Aztecs as monsters? Cortés and his men, vastly outnumbered, formed alliances with Aztec enemies. Tribes like the Tlaxcalans, who had suffered under Aztec tribute and feared being taken for sacrifice. With their help, and with European disease already spreading through native populations, the Spanish reached the gates of Tenochtitlan. Moctezuma II, the Aztec emperor, believed Cortés might be a god, or perhaps he simply hoped diplomacy would delay war. Either way, the Spanish were welcomed into the capital, but fear, misunderstanding, and ambition ignited conflict. Tensions escalated, leading to bloodshed, rebellion, and chaos. In 1521, after months of brutal siege, starvation, and disease, the mighty city of Tenochtitlan fell. The temples were destroyed, the idols were torn down, the empire was no more. To the Spanish, this was triumph, victory over barbarism. They wrote of ending satanic rituals, liberating innocent captives, and bringing salvation to a lost people. They proudly claimed they had ended a culture of horror, but in truth, they did not erase the violence. They only replaced its face. The Aztecs' gods were dethroned, but the sword still ruled. In place of Huitzilopochtli, the sun and war god, came the Christian cross, carried by priests who sometimes watched as entire villages were forced to convert under threat of death. Sacred altars were smashed, and new churches built upon their ruins. Ancient calendars were burned, statues buried or defaced. The skull racks disappeared, but heads still rolled, now in the name of empire, not eternity. The Spanish outlawed human sacrifice, calling it demonic, but they did not outlaw forced labor, torture, or public executions. Thousands of native people were enslaved, shipped off to distant colonies, or worked to death in silver mines. Epidemics devastated what remained. Entire cities vanished. In just a few decades, the population of central Mexico dropped from millions to mere thousands. The gods of the Aztecs were not just defeated, they were erased from memory, demonized in Christian sermons as devils and idols. The rituals, once performed under open skies, were driven into shadows. Still, some survived in secret. People whispered prayers to the old gods beneath their breath while attending Catholic Mass. They carved their deities into the corners of saints. They wove ancient symbols into embroidered clothes. Resistance lived not in rebellion, but in memory. What happened to the gods when no one fed them anymore? Did they vanish into the ether, forgotten, or did they remain silent witnesses to their own downfall? Huitzilopochtli, once nourished by hearts, fell quiet. Tezcatlipoca, the smoking mirror, no longer heard the chants of warriors. Zip Totec, the flayed god of renewal, was buried beneath church floors. Their temples crumbled, their songs faded, their calendars stopped turning. Yet echoes of them remain, etched into stone, lingering in Nahuatl words, remembered in rituals that the colonizers couldn't fully destroy. The Day of the Dead, now wrapped in Catholic imagery, still honors spirits with offerings, candles, and food, echoes of the older world, hidden in plain sight. To the Spaniards, the conquest was a holy war, but to the native people, it was apocalypse. Their world, so carefully balanced on myth and ritual, was torn apart. The gods had failed them, or perhaps had been betrayed. The priests who once ruled the temples were humiliated or killed, their wisdom lost. The ritual calendars, once tracking the fates of gods and humans alike, were replaced with Gregorian dates and Christian feasts. A society once built around sacred blood was now under the rule of men who claimed to bring salvation, even as they brought destruction. So did the Spanish end the horror. Perhaps they ended one kind of terror, one shaped by sacrifice, fear of celestial collapse, and divine hunger. But in its place came a new kind of terror: colonialism, oppression, forced religion, cultural erasure. The Aztecs ruled through myth and ritual, binding society together with a shared sense of cosmic duty. The Spanish ruled through empire and economics, binding the land to a distant king and pope. The tools changed. Obsidian knives were replaced with muskets, stone temples with cathedrals, ritual sacrifice with military punishment. But fear remained. There's a haunting irony in how both cultures used death as justification. The Aztecs believed killing maintained the balance of the universe. The Spanish believed killing saved souls. Each believed they were right, each believed the other was evil, and caught between these two worldviews were the people, the farmers, artisans, warriors, children who simply wanted to live. After the fall of the Aztecs, many survivors adapted. Some intermarried with the Spanish, creating a new mestizo identity. Others preserved their culture in hidden forms. Nahuatl, the language of the Aztecs, survived and is still spoken today by over 1 million people. Traditional healers still use rituals that trace their roots to pre-Hispanic gods. Ceremonial dances, banned by the Spanish, eventually returned during festivals, now dressed in Catholic imagery, but rooted in ancient rhythm. The gods did not disappear. They adapted. They hid behind saints, slipped into songs and lived in silence. The fire never fully died. And yet, something was lost. The great temples will never rise again. The Tsompen Temple, the skull racks, will never return. The rituals that defined an empire have been reduced to artifacts in museums, symbols of a barbaric past. The Western world for centuries remembered the Aztecs not for their achievements but for their blood. Human sacrifice became their legacy. The horror overshadowed the brilliance. Few remembered the astronomers, the poets, the architects. Few remembered the love songs carved into stone or the advanced medical knowledge stored in codices. The story of the Aztecs was rewritten by their conquerors, and in that retelling, they became shadows, noble savages in the eyes of history. But the truth is more complex. The Aztecs lived in a world where gods walked beside them, where every sunrise was a blessing, every death a transformation. They built cities in the sky, tamed lakes, mapped stars, and sang to gods with breath and blood. They were not demons. They were human, flawed, brilliant, devoted, and doomed. Their world ended not because of divine punishment, but because of steel, sickness, and strategy. The Spanish won, not because of righteousness, but because of timing, alliances, and disease. What remains now is memory. We walk through museums filled with obsidian knives, gold ornaments, and feathered headdresses. We read codices that survived the fires, try to decode a world where time was sacred and death was a gift. We wonder what it must have felt like to grow up in a city where pyramids touched the clouds and gods demanded hearts. We imagine the silence that followed the fall, the quiet streets, the broken altars, the fear and confusion of those left behind. And we ask ourselves, was the terror truly ended or merely replaced? In the centuries that followed, the Spanish Empire too would fall. The cathedrals, once symbols of conquest, would become part of a new Mexican identity, a fusion of old and new, of native and European. The gods, perhaps, are still watching, not in temples but in stories, not in altars but in the land. The lakes are still there, the mountains still rise, and deep in the soil lie the bones of both victims and victors, mixed together, indistinguishable, resting beneath a sky they once worshipped in different names. The fall of the Aztec Empire was not just the end of a civilization, it was the end of a worldview, a cosmic system, a sacred rhythm. But some songs never truly end. They echo softly across the centuries, in language, in ritual, in memory. And though the temples are gone and the gods are silent, the people endure. And in their endurance, the story continues, not as a tale of horror, but as a reminder that every empire bleeds, every god fades, and yet something always survives. Long after their temples crumbled, long after the Spanish melted down their gold and burned their codices, the Aztecs remain, not as a living empire, not as rulers of cities or builders of pyramids, but as shadows in the imagination of the modern world. We speak of them with a kind of reverent dread. An ancient people remembered more for the rituals they performed than the knowledge they preserved. Their name invokes blood, sacrifice, skulls, and fire. In movies, books, and television, the Aztecs are often portrayed as violent priests standing atop stone pyramids, holding beating hearts to the sun. But beneath the imagery, beneath the horror stories we tell ourselves, lies a much deeper question. Do we fear them because of what they did, or because we don't fully understand why they did it? Modern pop culture continues to pull from the Aztec past, sometimes in curiosity, often in fear. Adventure movies depict lost temples with cursed gold. Video games turn Aztec gods into bosses to be defeated. Even comic books and fantasy novels borrow from the Empire's obsession with death to create villains and dark lore. Their symbols, serpent gods, skull racks, obsidian blades, have become shorthand for the exotic and the terrifying. Rarely are the Aztecs shown tending floating gardens, composing poetry, or charting the stars. Instead, they are remembered through their darkest rituals. It is as though the modern world has chosen to freeze them at the moment of sacrifice, preserving not their greatness but their blood. And perhaps in doing so we've kept them alive, not as a civilization but as a cautionary tale. The fascination with Aztec horror isn't new. Even the Spanish conquistadors wrote about them with a mix of admiration and disgust. Hernán Cortés and the priests who followed him were stunned by the scale of Aztec cities, the beauty of their architecture, the complexity of their calendars, but horrified by the sight of human sacrifices, the racks of skulls, the rituals involving flaying and burning. These accounts spread across Europe, painted the Aztecs as powerful and monstrous, a people whose brilliance was tainted by blood. That image has lingered for centuries, and yet we now know that those reports were often exaggerated or written to justify conquest. The fear they instilled was not only about what the Aztecs did, but what they represented: a world governed by gods not of mercy but of hunger. In museums today, artifacts from the Aztec Empire still shock visitors. Jagged obsidian blades designed to slice flesh, carvings of gods with serpent tongues and hollow eyes, statues of Totec, the flayed god, wearing human skin as a sacred cloak. A replica of the Tzompantli, the skull rack, stands as a grim reminder that death was never hidden in Aztec society. It was displayed proudly, ritually and publicly. But among these eerie objects are others more subtle: delicate jewelry, painted codices, tools for astronomy, and beautifully crafted masks. These speak of a society that loved beauty, that studied the heavens, that honored their dead not only through sacrifice but through memory, song and story. Archaeologists continue to make discoveries that leave even seasoned experts in stunned silence. In recent decades, beneath the streets of Mexico City, once Tenochtitlan, excavations have uncovered layers of human remains, ceremonial pits filled with bones, and entire altars untouched for centuries. One of the most astonishing finds was the Tzompantli, the Great Skull Tower, discovered near the Templo Mayor. More than 600 skulls were found, carefully arranged, many pierced through and mortared together, forming a circular wall of death. This wasn't chaos, it was planned, it was sacred. To the Aztecs, it was beautiful. To us, it is terrifying. The reactions from modern observers, disgust, awe, disbelief, reveal just how far removed we are from the mindset that created such a structure. And yet, something about it pulls us in. The horror is magnetic. Still, we must ask, were the Aztecs truly evil, or have we simply chosen to view them through a narrow, fearful lens? They were not the only civilization to perform human sacrifice. The ancient Egyptians buried servants with their pharaohs. The Celts are believed to have made ritual offerings. Even the Roman gladiator games, bloody spectacles of death for entertainment, shared echoes of ritualized violence. And yet, we often give these cultures the benefit of historical context. With the Aztecs, we freeze them at the moment the obsidian knife falls. We rarely allow them the same complexity. Why? Part of the answer lies in timing. The Aztecs were at their peak when the Spanish arrived, and the Spanish controlled the narrative. Their writings, letters, and sermons became the foundation for how the world saw the Aztec world. But those documents were not objective. They were filled with justifications for conquest, moral superiority, and religious condemnation. They focused on the most shocking aspects of the empire while ignoring or minimizing the rest. For centuries, those views shaped textbooks, paintings, and later film and fiction. Only recently have historians begun to reclaim the full story. It's important to understand that for the Aztecs, sacrifice was not mindless cruelty. It was a form of communication with the divine. The gods had bled to create the world, and it was humanity's duty to return that gift. The ritual was not just about killing, it was about balance, cosmic order, reciprocity. It was a way to keep the sun moving across the sky, the rain falling, the crops growing. In a world without modern science, this belief made sense. It provided structure, purpose, and even comfort. People believed they were participating in the survival of the universe itself. When we view them only through the lens of brutality, we strip away their humanity, the love they had for their gods, their land, their people. Today, scholars try to understand the Aztecs in their full context. Their engineering achievements, their agricultural innovations, their complex political systems, their poetry, some of which has survived, reveals a society deeply aware of life's fragility. In one famous poem, an Aztec poet wonders why all things must pass, why flowers wither, why songs end. It is the voice of a people who understood beauty and mortality, not only through sacrifice but through reflection. And yet, those voices are often drowned out by the imagined sound of drums beating atop a pyramid, the flash of obsidian in the sun, the cries of victims. Our modern fear of the Aztecs says more about us than it does about them. We live in a world where death is hidden. Hospitals, morgues, and cemeteries keep it out of sight. Ritual has been replaced with routine. Faith for many has become distant. The Aztecs, by contrast, lived face to face with death every day. They honored it, danced with it, carved it into stone, and in doing so they gave it meaning. That terrifies us. Because deep down, we wonder if we've lost something they once understood, that death, though frightening, is sacred, that to forget it is to forget what it means to live. Even now, the Aztecs continue to haunt us. Their imagery is used in music videos, fashion, even tattoos. Their gods inspire both fear and fascination. Tourists flock to ancient sites in Mexico, hoping to feel the energy of temples that once echoed with chants. Historians debate their ethics. Artists reimagine their mythology. In a strange way, they've never been more alive, and yet we still hesitate to embrace them fully. We want to keep them at a distance, exotic, mysterious, dangerous. Because if we truly stepped into their world, we might have to confront the parts of ourselves we've buried. Our need for ritual, our fear of meaninglessness, our awe before death. There is no simple answer to the question. Were the Aztecs evil or misunderstood? They were capable of horror, yes, but also of wisdom, of brutality, and of beauty. Like all civilizations, they were a reflection of their time, shaped by landscape, myth, necessity, and fear. Their legacy is not clean, but neither is ours. We remember them not because they were monsters, but because they dared to live in full view of mortality, because they built temples to death and found poetry in pain, because their story forces us to look at history not as a parade of progress, but as a mirror, one that shows us both the light and the shadow of humanity. So the next time you see an image of a blood-soaked altar, or a stone carving with a god's wide, staring eyes, ask yourself, what are you really afraid of? The past, or the part of the past that still lives inside us? The Aztecs are not gone. They live in bones beneath the earth, in stories passed down in Nahuatl, in festivals that light candles for the dead, in the silence that falls when we speak of gods and don't know what to believe. Their legacy is one of fear, yes, but also of remembrance, and perhaps that, more than anything else, is why they still haunt us.